You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev.
Radio MMT.
Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us. Welcome to another edition of Radio MMT, and again this week we have James, who is stepping in for Anne. How are you, James?
James is good, Kev. It's
Excellent.
great to be here. Happy to exercise my economics nerd brain again.
Terrific. And so this week we're going to continue the conversation that we had last week. You know how Anne's on holidays, that's why you're here. But incidentally, Larry and Larissa, our listeners, need to be informed that Anne is having a mental health break, a well-being break. She's taking time off to look after herself, and she's not supposed to be listening to the show, but she did. And she told me, she said, "You're talking about well-being, but you didn't actually say what well-being was."
Great question.
We sort of talked around well-being. We talked about well-being, but we didn't actually talk exactly. We didn't define it properly. And so I got told off. You know, it's a bit like, I've been describing Anne as my very competent older sister.
Yeah.
And I'm like the well-intended but lame-assed teenage brother. So anyway, and I took her point, and it was true. So we're going to flesh out well-being a bit this week, which is a good thing to do. We're going to have a letter from the Cape from Bill Mitchell. I'm going to have a little bit of a talk about post-referendum stuff. That's kind of what we got at the moment. That's the show, essentially.
Yeah.
You know, a bit of this, a bit of that, and anything else that springs to mind, James.
Yes, the economics brain is ready to go.
Ready to go?
I could talk about well-being for hours because that's where my research is.
Yeah. So you're doing a PhD in well-being.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the idea is I wanted to look into what this idea of the well-being economy is. That to me seemed like a really nice way to affect change under the name of well-being economics. I was very interested in degrowth economics, but I feel the messaging and I guess the marketing of that degrowth is a missile word. It's very controversial. We need to degrow.
Yeah.
So well-being economy is kind of the positive version of that, where we need to look at how an economy can actually create well-being for people and the planet.
Yeah, I guess if you use terms like degrowth in our very neoclassical framing of economics, we've been lulled into this understanding that we need constant growth. You know, everything's about growth figures. I used to do events and I used to do corporate events. And it was like hell. And all these corporate events, they'd say, "Rightio, what's our projections for next year? We need to have growth. So if you say the word degrowth in a capitalist society that's hell-bent on growth, it's a bit like saying you're a socialist in the 1950s living in the States. They'll go, "Well, you're the traitor." So you have to find better words because, like, you and I will go through all the detail, but anybody else who's listening, they just grab the catchphrases, the headlines. So you say degrowth, and they go, "You're a heretic. You're going to destroy everything." And you go, "No, we're trying to fix everything." And it's so words are important. So there is that. Now, how should we do today's show? We would just jump into Bill Mitchell's letter from the Cape.
Yeah, I'm really excited to hear that.
Yeah, rightio. Okay, well, you talk for a bit while I try and find it.
No worries. Well, Bill talks about housing, I believe, in this, which is very important at this time.
Yeah.
There is a housing crisis going on. And I think there's a lot of myths about the housing market and housing crisis and supply and demand. I think the MMT lens can really help shed a light on that.
Yeah, and I know that Bill's views on public housing are quite personal, because he's a product of public housing.
Just like Elbow.
Just like Albo, yeah. Well, yeah. I think it'd be an interesting conversation putting Albo and Bill in the same room.
Yes.
They'd have a lot of points of connection, but I reckon they might disagree on a few things as well. Anyway, I listen to Bill. He tries to give this neutral sort of persona, being an economics man, but sometimes he slips. And from what I've heard in this one, he slips a bit. Let's have a listen. It's time for a letter from the Cape
with economist Bill Mitchell.
Hello, and here is another episode in my Letter from the Cape podcast series. The National Housing Supply Council was abolished on November the 8th, 2013 by the Australian Coalition Government, along with a number of other non-statutory government bodies. The claim was that these bodies were no longer needed, or that there simply wasn't enough funds to keep them going. The National Housing Supply Council had been established in May 2008 with the purpose of monitoring housing demand, supply and affordability in Australia, and to highlight current and potential gaps between housing supply and demand. While it was functioning, it regularly published estimates, projections, analysis and policy advice in relation to housing supply and demand. Its annual State of Supply report became an embarrassment to government. The first report, published in 2009, the year after the council began its work, told of growing shortages in housing supply, declining housing affordability, and low-income families being trapped in the private rental market because they are unable to access adequate social housing. The report disclosed the growing gap between the demand for social housing, that is, accommodation that is within the financial reach of low-income families, and the supply. By 2011, the Council reported that the shortfall in such housing, which was both affordable and available to the lowest income households, had reached 539,000 units. The Council's last report was published in March 2013, just after the Federal Minister for Housing changed the terms of reference for the Council as a first step towards its ultimate abolition some 8 months later. The embarrassment was because successive governments had abandoned their responsibilities for ensuring there was adequate housing available, particularly for poorer Australians. On January 1, 2023, in the midst of a growing housing crisis in Australia, the new federal Labor government established an interim National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, which had similar goals to the original. A permanent body has now been announced and will commence work in December 2023. The interim body published one report in July 2023. The change in narrative from those original reports in 2009 to now is stark. The current narrative is replete with analysis of the role of government as an agency to provide de-risking for the market. What does that mean? De-risking is everywhere now. It refers to the process by which governments give handouts or guarantees or other inducements to reduce or eliminate the risk of private corporations investing in large-scale infrastructure projects. so the private investor knows that they will profit under all circumstances and the risk remains within the public sector. Last Monday, for example, the Shadow Chancellor in Britain, who in all likelihood will become the next Chancellor, which in Australian terminology is the Treasury Minister, outlines what she claims is a bold plan to revitalise Britain's failing and degraded public infrastructure. She said the central responsibility of government was to create a de-risked environment for private investment. Years of neoliberal neglect, justified on the basis that the government did not have enough money, has seen vital public assets such as water, transport, power and more privatised and become vehicles for private profit-seeking corporations to bleed dry. Short-termism exemplified. Other assets that remained in the public sector have been run down. Now, the solution apparently is more of the same. The same applies in most nations, given the global reach of the neoliberal ideology. Leading the de-risking charge has been the so-called Bidenomics in the US, with its central theme of promoting infrastructure development by reducing the risk for private investors. His administration announced billions in extra funding to build new and revitalised public infrastructure after years of neglect. Sounds good, but the funds are being allocated to ensure that there is a secure revenue stream for private investors, corporate welfare. De-risking means that the government, which claims it cannot build an adequate supply of housing or other essential public infrastructure because it doesn't have the cash, commits to providing all sorts of guarantees, subsidies, grants and straight-out handouts to corporations. The de-risking agenda also promotes further deregulation, the so-called euphemistic regulatory streamlining, which reduces accountability and oversight with the inevitable result that the standards slip as even more shonky operators enter the construction sector. And of course, public-private partnerships are touted as ways in which the government can shift the risk of large projects onto the market. Except in the case of essential infrastructure, such as hospitals, transport, utilities, etc., the risk can never shift. The government is always ultimately responsible for the supply of services in these areas. So all that happens is that there is a massive transfer of public money to private profiteering corporations and a diminished quality and scope of service as cost-cutting becomes the norm. The problem is that national infrastructure planning then becomes subjugated to what private corporations consider is profitable rather than what the nation actually needs. We are going to see a lot of this in the policy development seeking to address climate change. And given the massive housing shortage, particularly for lower income families, the market is poised to reap dramatic profits from government handouts, and in return Australia will get poorly built, energy inefficient fields of roofs and concrete. It is no surprise that the Australian Labor government appointed the CEO of a major construction company as the chair of the interim National Housing and Affordability Council. The starting point in responding to this neoliberal narrative lies in rejecting the fiction that the government cannot afford to fund the construction of public infrastructure and public housing. In the 1950s and beyond, that is the way the nation was built, and it provided first-class public infrastructure and adequate housing for those in need. We now have a shortage of some 800,000 social housing units because of government neglect, justified by the fiction they didn't have the cash. The federal government has all the cash it needs to build those houses, and the only issue is the availability of productive resources. But given it plans to de-risk the market to build more houses, then the resources will be there. Why should private corporations reap massive profits from government handouts when the same outcome, more houses, can be built at resource cost without the leakage to the top end of town? I'll be back next time. Until then, see you later.
CR, here to stay.
Where do we start with that, James? Where do we start? It's there's so much in that. For starters, if we're talking about well-being, having a decent roof over your head is core to that. And I know that Bill's circumstances, along with Albanese, you're talking about circumstances post-war where this stuff was needed, but it's still needed now. The only difference between then and now is that we've got a lot more people sleeping on the streets. We never used to have that. So well-being and having a roof over your head is crucial. But how do we do that?
Well, it's not just having a roof over your head, it's also having a secure roof over your head as well, which is important for well-being. Housing insecurity, which is simply not knowing if you'll be living in the same place for an extended period of time, is really bad for well-being. It's bad for your mental health. You're constantly worrying whether your rent is going to go up or you're going to be evicted at any point. It's bad for your physical health also in the cost of living crisis. If you're paying rent, sometimes you have to forego other expenses, especially if rent goes up. The list goes on, and housing I find it so interesting that housing, the way we talk about housing is an asset rather than a basic need or a human right.
Well, that's something that's shifted dramatically over the last 30 years or so, and certainly in my lifetime. When I was in my late 20s, early 30s, you could afford a house. People could afford a house. It was I was working as a casual theatre technician. My partner at the time was working as a youth worker. We weren't on big incomes. We could afford to buy a house. My daughter, who's now around the age that we were when we bought a house, wouldn't stand a hope in hell of touching anything like we had. Her prospects are reduced to small apartments, and that's because all the profile of housing has changed from being something to live in to something which you make money on. And anybody who's just looking for something to live in is priced out of the market by those people who are trying to make not trying to make a buck, are using their resources to turn housing into a profit-making venture.
And then you see people owning 5, 10 homes that they live off. And I think the elephant in the room with all this housing talk, especially in politics, is that politicians are an investor class themselves. A lot of them have nice housing portfolios. I know Albo himself has a $5 million housing portfolio himself.
God, yeah.
And this is happening all over the world as well. I know it's happening in Ireland with a specific housing crisis, that the politicians have an incentive not to flood the market with new homes, new affordable homes, because that would affect their property portfolios. It's going to pull down
their property portfolios, And so I wonder how Albo reconciles this with himself, because he's a product of public housing. He now has a portfolio. I'd like to think that I get the feeling that Labor is often trapped by neoliberal economics. Like, remember when Shorten went into the 2019 election and was talking about altering some of the mix of tax concessions, and it was all going to be grandfathered, so it wasn't going to affect anybody with current properties. He got slaughtered. Okay, if you even hint that you're going to do anything to lessen the cash cow that comes out of the property market at the moment, see you later. You're unelectable. So, I'd like to think Albo seems like a nice guy. I'd like to think that in his heart he would like to do more, but you have to understand the political realities, I guess. If you're on the opposition benches, you can do nothing. If you're in power, you might be able to tweak away at it, but big changes aren't warmly accepted by the electorate, especially with that sort of stuff.
No, not at all. And he's hamstrung by the neoliberal logic that both major parties subscribe to. And just to recap what neoliberalism is, because it's a big word,
Yep.
and I often see that big word and go, oh boy, what does that mean?
Yep.
It kind of means three things that governments do. They deregulate trade,
Yep.
they deregulate internal regulation, so less rules, less laws, less things inhibiting actors to do certain things, and it's also massive privatization.
Yeah.
And it's all about the idea that government should get out of the way of business, let the free market do its thing,
Let it find its natural balance.
Yep, and that, in their mind, is the most efficient way to get well-being for everyone.
Well,
at the end of the day.
if you're listening to Bill's talk, then he mentions how the Labor government, the previous Labor government to the one we're in now, had set up a department to look at public housing. The coalition government promptly abolished that, and now the Labor government has set one up again. So you can see that the Labor government has some intent to do the right thing, but it is captured by neoclassical economics, and it's sort of got like a foot in both camps. It wants to do more progressive things, but if it tries too much, it's going to get voted out, and then nothing will get done. So it's like I can understand the frustration, and I know people in the Labor Party, and I know that they're frustrated by a lot of compromise policies. But it's kind of the nature of politics that if you don't compromise, you are sidelined, and and then you do nothing. So do you want to do something? Do you want to do a half-assed compromise something, or nothing except scream from the sidelines? It's tricky. It's not a good position to be in. But this all comes from like the whole privatisation thing. You know, so Labor now has this future housing fund.
Yes.
Which is an arse-about way of funding public housing. But they're not looking at public housing. They're looking at social housing, or it's a different model. It's not straight out government-owned property. It's like these partnerships they do with the private sector, and they're funding that with a future fund, which is supposed to raise income so that the books balance, and it's all captured by neoliberalism. This is what the Greens were kind of fighting them, saying you don't need to do this. But they're sort of saying, look, in reality we don't. But sort of technically we don't. But in reality, we have to appear that we're appeasing the neoclassical economists.
Yeah, the housing thing itself. We're going to take $10 billion, I think it was. Yeah. Put it on the stock market. Yeah. Then any money we make back, we'll use to build houses. Yeah. And then you just think, why don't you just use that $10 billion to build houses that you're putting on the stock market? It's just a big gamble, isn't it?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, like they'll say that by doing so, they're balancing the books. But if there's one thing we've got to get rid of, it's this concept that you need to balance the books. Yeah. You just don't need to balance the books. Governments need to run deficits to support the economy, and I'm going to scream this from the every opportunity is that deficits are essential for running proper economies. You might run up the occasional surplus for a reason, but deficits are the norm. That's how economy. That's the foundations of an economy is government deficits. If you had no government deficits, your economy would be wiped out. Yeah. So the whole concept that they need to invest in the stock market to raise money to pay for any sort of social housing program is completely bogus.
It's a bit silly, isn't it?
Except that they need to appease the neoclassical economists who will tear them down, and they'll lose the next election if they seem to be, so-called incompetent. It's annoying.
A government deficit is more money in our pockets. It's a surplus for the rest of us.
Correct. Government deficit, private sector surplus.
Exactly.
Yep. That's not difficult to understand. How come nobody understands that, James?
Well, we've been conditioned to think a certain way, haven't we? Growth is good, everyone's rational and self-interested, and the deficits are bad. It's just all...
What was the cognitive dissonance?
Cognitive dissonance,
That's the foundation of the whole bloody thing. It's a very, very annoying... Hey, did you know, just out of, here's an interesting sort of... And this is typical of how our economy works, is that Trump's dad, what's his name, Trump? What's his first name? I've forgotten already. That's good.
It's Donald. Just Daddy Trump, isn't it?
Dickhead Trump. No, Donald Trump, that's right. His dad made his fortune by receiving government money to build apartments for returned soldiers after World War II. That's how the Trump fortune was accumulated, was direct government funding. And they said, go and build some apartments and house all the returned soldiers. So when Trump talks about being a self-made man, etc., no, that's a really clear example of how governments can inject money into the economy, but it's also a way of how it's sort of it's polarized. That should have been spread more even. And this is another thing that Bill was saying through his talk before, was that this idea that governments need to engage with private sector firms and shore them up, pump money into them to make sure that they're safe and that they can build these projects. Why? Why not just do it like we used to have a public service? We used to have the Melbourne and Metropolitan Board of Works and all these, the SEC, Telecom, etc. And we were told that they were too inefficient, that government organisations were inefficient. I'm a telecommunications cabler. I've got my ticket. I haven't done much of it. You look at the old telecom stuff, it is absolute gold class. Like, those guys spent the time to make sure that the system was rock solid, and the workmanship in it is magnificent. Compare that today, where you've got your person coming in doing your NBN connection, and they'll just smack a hole through a wall, drag a cable through, and get out of there as quickly as they can, because they're on a fixed price, installation fee, and the quicker they get it done, the better. And we're saying that this is a better system.
Yeah.
They
call it efficient.
Efficient.
But it's an efficiency. What's efficiency all about? Efficiency for a really good product, or efficiency for generating profit? They're two different things.
Exactly. And I would suggest that any inefficiencies of the public service would be outweighed enormously by the rorts of the private sector doing the same job. When you add in the advertising and the competition that they need to, the skullduggery that they need to win a contract and all that sort of stuff, it's. To me, I know what I would prefer to have as a system of infrastructure.
To bring it back to an economic term, what businesses are really good at is generating externalities, right? They can do things really efficiently, but often that comes at the cost of the social world and the environmental world, social and environmental externalities, which is basically saying they often make a mess. They make a mess of the environment by doing things hyper efficiently.
Yeah.
They make a mess of communities by doing things according to profitable efficiency.
And this comes back to our topic of well-being, is that the only thing that you're looking at in a neoclassical model is the profit, the profit margin. That's it. That's the measure of whether something is being done well or not. How much money did you make? If you made a lot of money, apparently it went really well. And when you value the result of something purely by the profit margin and disregard everything else, your model is very shallow and very incomplete, and that's the problem we have with well-being. Now, I'm still. This is kind of a bit off topic, but we're sort of winding down after the referendum, the S23 referendum. So I'd like to go half into the midway break of this show, just reflecting on that a bit. And there was a lot of disappointment about the result of the referendum from anybody who was involved in the Yes campaign. And I was involved in the Yes campaign, and I was disappointed because no states got up. And you looked at the figures and you went, oh, this is dismal. And I looked at it a bit more. So there's a 40% yes vote.
Yes.
Right? Now, the profile of a yes voter is somebody who actively wants positive change, progressive change. You don't vote yes by mistake, right?
Yep.
You vote yes with intent, and you go, I'm voting yes because I realise that there's a problem that needs to be improved, and I'm going to try and do something about it. So there's 40% of the vote. You've then got the progressive no vote, which essentially says the same thing. It says we have a problem, it needs to be fixed, but what you're suggesting is inadequate.
Yep.
A lot more needs to be done. But essentially, you've got the yes and the progressive no vote with the same aim.
Yep.
And this is typical of the left. We always have different ways of doing things, and we can fight and squabble about that. But essentially, that's the same camp. The progressive no and the yes both recognise that there's a problem which needs to be fixed. And so that would put it at about 45, 50% of the vote, because you've got 40% of the yes is yes, and then there'd be some percentage of the no vote would be progressive no.
Yep.
So there's about half the vote saying that we need change.
Yep.
We need change. So then you got the other half of the vote, which is the no vote. Well, I was out at the polling booths and handing out literature, and I was in South Dandenong, where English was a second language for 95% of the people there. And I simply asked the question, do you understand, got any questions, and do you understand what the referendum's about? And they sort of go, yeah, no, actually.
Yeah.
And they say, what's it about? And so I'd tell them what it's about, and they go, oh, well, that's all good. So so what I could discern from that was that I reckon about half and half was half of them were redneck racists and the other half were just misinformed and were, what would you say, insecure. The seeds of doubt had been sown by the No campaign, and they convinced the other half of their camp that, oh, look, there's something dodgy going on here, so don't vote for it because, like, you know, the sky's going to fall in and all that sort of stuff. So you could say that, a rough guess, half the No camp from that side would be racist to some degree, and the other half were misinformed. So if you've got half of 50% is 25%. We've got 50% who want progressive change, another 25% of people who are misinformed. But when I spoke to them, they understood the problem and were on board. So I reckon if you could get the information to that other 25%, you'd have 75% of the population who would back progressive change. It's just that it's really hard to do in a referendum because if you've got 25 to 30% of your population who are racist to some degree, they will tear that campaign down, and they did. I was there listening to the words that were being coming. They didn't even understand. They're saying they're going to change the law, and I said, they're not changing the law, they're changing the Constitution. It's a different thing. Do you understand what the Constitution is? And these No campaigners didn't understand what the Constitution was, and were just spinning stuff. You're sort of going, right, well, you know, and they were very effective. So I'm a little more optimistic about the result than I first was.
Right.
Because I think that if we could get, and this is part of the truth-telling process, is that if we could get that message out there, there is progressive change. The one thing that really pissed me off, and this is the same with everything, is this line that, oh, it's going to cost you. I think it was Clive Palmer said that first the voice, then the invoice. And it's part of this same old ridiculous line that that it's going to cost, which is, it's just... It's going to not. Yes, it's going to cost, but it's not going to cost you or me. It's going to be a public expense. Well worthwhile. And we spend things in the public on many, many things. Submarines, all sorts of stuff. Why not spend some money on some good things? Anyway, so that's my little rant.
It's a good rant, Kev.
It's
a good rant.
It's supposed to be a little bit of optimism. I think we need to head to a bit of a break, capture our thoughts, and then we'll come back and talk about well-being, because that's what we're supposed to be talking about today. You're with Anne and Kev on Radio MMT.
At 3CR Community Radio in Melbourne, Australia.
And wherever you get your podcasts.
Economics for the rest of us.
Anne and Kev on Radio MMT
At 3CR Community Radio in Melbourne, Australia.
and wherever you get your podcasts.
Economics for the rest of us.
So during the break, we heard from the Warumpi Band. I love the Warumpi Band.
Legends.
That's from quite some time ago. Let's talk about well-being.
Yes.
James, now you're doing a PhD on well-being.
Yes.
But you're also talking economics, and so it's the intersection of economics and well-being. Well, it should be obvious because
Yeah.
economics is the distribution of resources in a community, and that should equate to well-being. What are your thoughts?
Well, just to start off, I think the easiest definition of well-being, there's a lot of different definitions, as with everything, especially in the academic world, but the easiest definition of well-being that makes sense is it's just a multi-dimensional understanding of health. So you call it holistic health. So, there's physical health, there's mental health, but there's also economic health, your income and your resources. There's spiritual health, how you connect to the world around you. There's emotional health, how are your emotions, how are you feeling? Are you feeling good about your life, short-term and long-term? So it's this concept that kind of encompasses your whole world and basically evaluates how you're going. So if you have well-being, things are pretty bloody good. I have studied the topic for almost 2 years now, and I'm kind of concluding that not many people in the world actually have well-being. It's a kind of a scarce thing because of the way our economic system works.
It's I've seen some stuff on this, and the correlation between being wealthy and well-being is not. Well, it doesn't correlate. You
No.
hear of communities who, on paper, aren't wealthy, but their well-being is right up there.
Yeah.
And then you have people who are quite wealthy, and their well-being is not up there. I think you could be wealthy and have well-being, and I think you could be not have wealth and have poor well-being at the same time. So, talk about that. What's happening there?
Well, wealth has been found to not correlate with well-being. It's a very case-by-case thing. What you can say about wealth is that it solves all your money problems, right? So you
Right.
can have the resources to then get well, get healthy. We all know really wealthy people who don't seem very happy, who aren't very healthy, and that's a failure both on their part but also society's part to help them be their best self. The other thing about well-being is it's a case-by-case thing. It depends on each person what their well-being looks like. So I draw on Amartya Sen's work a lot. Do you know Amartya Sen, Kev?
Never heard.
So he is an Indian academic, economist, welfare economist, and he coined what was called the capabilities approach, which basically says people want to live a good life, and to help them live a good life, you need to ensure that they have appropriate functionings and capabilities. So capabilities as in the ability to do what they want in the world. So this society structures things in a certain way where you can only do certain things. And the capability approach says we need to look at what people can do and what they can't do and remedy that to help people live a life that they value.
So just fleshing that out a bit. So
Yeah.
rather than finding some crap job just because you have to, because you need money, you're talking about finding something that you're suited to, and that will obviously contribute to your well-being.
Yeah.
This actually ties into the job guarantee conversation
does.
quite a lot. So,
It does.
So for anybody that's familiar with the job guarantee, that's an obligation of the government to provide work to anybody who's looking for work, but it's voluntary and it needs to be in something which is fulfilling, and it redefines work in many respects. It also draws upon the notion that to feel well, you need to be socially connected. You need to have some sense of community, and I guess it's no surprise that in a neoliberal system which highlights the individual, and Maggie Thatcher said it herself, there is no such thing as society.
Yeah.
We're all just individuals, and so neoliberalism is an attack on well-being because it disconnects us from society, I guess.
Yes. So the neoliberal understanding of well-being stems from the neoliberal understanding of what humans are. And so neoliberals assume that humans are fundamentally self-interested creatures that maximize their pleasure and minimize their pain, and that they are rational. That's their assumption of what human nature is, which is a very flawed assumption of people, because people aren't totally self-interested.
No.
Lots of people dedicate their lives to people around them, to their communities, to their planet, you know. In a place like 3CR, totally disproves that assumption about what humans are, because so many people in here are doing stuff for the world around them that often is quite a painful thing. It is a painful thing to be an activist often.
Sure, and I'd suggest that any sporting team flies in the face of that too. People do sport. It often costs some money. You know, it's not until you get to the elite level that you're going to start making a buck. For the other 99% of us, why are we there? It's because we like being in teams. We like being involved in community activities. It's a way of connecting to
For
those
the love of
around
the
us.
game, for the love of life, for the love of all this.
Yeah.
So when we talk about well-being from a neoliberal perspective, it's about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. And that's basically the calculus.
It's kind of like a narcissistic approach to
It is. It is.
and that's your base model. That's the base unit of your whole economic structure is a narcissist.
And that's their argument for the free market. Everyone's self-interested. Everyone will do what's good for them. So let government get out of the way so people can do that.
Yeah.
Now, that's been fundamentally disproven as a model of society, you know.
Yeah.
Governments make markets possible, and MMT stresses that.
Yep.
It's impossible to have markets without someone who sets the rules of the game, the rules of exchange, the infrastructure so people can get to the market, these sorts of things. So it's a very flawed view of human nature, fundamentally, at this, and a very flawed view of the world and how it works.
So, and I guess this feeds into the intersection between well-being and economics, because
Yes.
if we are trapped in a system, and I refer to us as hamsters in the wheel, that we've got to keep on spinning stuff, this economic structure loves us to be in debt, because when you're in debt, you have to keep on working for some way, and if you're forced to work, the corporations love that because that they can use you, they can exploit you, and that's how we operate. So here we have a prime example of an economic system that is set up to undermine well-being. It disconnects people, it regards us as individuals, it throws away the notion of society, and it turns us into slaves.
Yep.
There's plenty we could do to change that. That to me seems quite apparent. One of the things I'd like to talk about is the measurement of our society is done by the GDP, the gross domestic product, which basically quantifies how much money has been spent in our economy, and that's the measure of success. You got any thoughts on that?
Yes, I do.
Thoughts you
So
might.
GDP is the proxy for a society's well-being right now. It says the more goods and services we have, the more stuff we make, the more money there is, the better off everyone is, because everyone's self-interested, everyone's seeking pleasure. GDP is a proxy for progress. So it was thought up by Simon Kuznets back in the 30s, prior to World War II, just out of the Great Depression.
Right.
And he said himself,
I'll tell you what he said, because I've got this
You've
quote.
got
in front,
the quote.
I've got this quote in front
it's a
of me.
great quote.
It says, this is from Simon Kuznets, the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income as defined by GDP. Goals for more growth should specify of what and for what. So you've got the you've got the architect of GDP, the guy that invented GDP, who came up with the notion of GDP, saying that it's not a good measurement.
Yeah. Nonetheless, the Americans pioneered the use of GDP. You know, it was essential for their World War II effort. And then upon that, the entire world economic system after World War II was promoted by the Americans based around GDP. This is the way for everyone to develop so that they can be healthy and well and have a good society, and we're all wealthy and prosperous.
You say that, but I've got another quote here as well.
Here we go.
And I got these from Associate Professor Philip Lawn. Okay, and he starts off this thing. So this is from Robert F. Kennedy. So this has got to be during the 60s at some stage. So you can see that there's a battle going on between our ideologies here. And he says, when I find it, he says, too much and too long, we seem to have surrendered community excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things. The GNP, which is the gross national product, which is the same as the gross domestic product, it's the American term for it. I'm going to call it the GDP. The GDP counts air pollution and cigarette advertising and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile.
Full stop.
Okay, so this is post-war America.
Yes.
And still there's this notion that that material wealth does not equal well-being.
There was an economist by the name of Easterlin who proved this in the 70s, that material wealth does not correlate with subjective well-being, which is how you feel about your life. Are you happy? Is your life going well? They're not connected.
Right.
They're two very different things. So when we talk about GDP, when you see GDP referred to, it is a flawed assumption of how a nation's going.
It's a flawed measurement.
Yes.
It's used all the time as an indicator of how well we're doing.
Yep.
But it has nothing to do with well-being.
It's like assessing the entire health of your car based on how the air conditioning's going.
Yeah.
You know, it's a small part of a much larger thing.
Or I'd even say how fast it can go.
Yeah.
Like how fast can
That's
this
better.
car go? Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it a good car? Is it a safe car? Does it meet your other purposes? Is it efficient? No, it goes fast, mate. She's a beaut, and that's it.
What direction is the car going into? It'll be driving towards a beautiful
Doesn't
mountain?
matter, mate. She goes 100 miles an hour. It's
If you don't look at where you're going, you might drive off a cliff, which is exactly what we're worried about now with the economy.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of people working at the moment to find a better measurement of how a society's going than GDP. And the one that we often like here on this show is the genuine progress indicator.
This is by now. You're an academic, aren't you? Because
In the making.
Well, this is associate professor at the University of Newcastle, Philip
Yep.
Warren, who I've met a couple of times, and is a lovely guy. What's an associate professor? As opposed to a professor. Anyway, look,
It's all convoluted language. It doesn't mean a thing to me. They're basically doctors. That's
Okay.
all you need to know.
no worries. Anyway, look, Philip is a lovely, lovely guy and smart as a whip. And so he has constructed this thing called the GPI, the General Progress Indicator.
Yep.
Okay. Do you know much about it at all?
Yeah, I know bits and pieces. So I've done my preparation.
Sure.
And the best thing about the GPI is that it actually accounts for environmental and social losses. So we talk about externalities. Economic gains often are made at social and environmental losses. We log native forests and we destroy communities so we can build big houses for rich people, that sort of thing.
Right. So there's a positive effect and there's a negative effect.
Yes.
And so straight away we've got a balance sheet where if you were talking about GDP, anything that's spent money is regarded as a positive.
Yep.
And so it just adds them all together. It doesn't distinguish between whether it has a positive influence or a negative influence on the well-being. It just says if you're spending money, it's good. So this straight away brings in the nuance of that if you're spending money, is it doing good or not?
Yes.
Okay.
So it splits the index into three categories. There's economic.
Yep.
There's environmental.
Yep.
And there's social.
Right.
So the economic one has a lot of different economic words like personal consumption expenditures, income inequality, all that. Don't necessarily need to worry about that at this point. The important thing of the GPI are the environmental and social indicators. So it's about 26 different indicators that make up this index of genuine progress, not just growth.
Yep.
Growth for what?
Yeah.
What's progress?
Okay, and just to give an example of that, if you have excellent GDP, that means that Gina Reinhardt's doing very well, but we've got people sleeping on the streets. So it doesn't indicate anything other than there's a lot of money, but it doesn't tell you who it's going to or what it's doing or how it's helping anyone. So that's the flaw of the GDP. This is becoming far more nuanced. It's saying, rightio. So how's this working? Who's it working for? That's the general nature of it.
So just to reel off a couple of the indicators in there, just to show what it's all about. So in addition to all the economic gains and losses, it takes into account the cost of water pollution, the cost of air pollution, the cost of noise pollution, loss of wetlands, loss of farmland, soil quality or degradation. It goes on to actually stipulate, all right, we're having economic gains, but these gains are not good if it comes at the losses of native forests, of soil quality, of soil degradation.
And these are things which GDP just does not cover.
It does not. And in the social one as well, it actually values housework and parenting. So under GDP, all the work you do at home to keep your house in order, to raise your kids, to look after people, that's seen as leisure under GDP in economics.
It's worth nothing because there's no money attached to it.
They say it's unproductive and it's valuable.
Which is a large part of the status of women post World War II and probably before then as well, where they're saying, well, you're doing all this stuff, but it's not worth anything because not earning any money.
It's just silly because the most productive thing is raising kids who are healthy and well, who will contribute to the betterment of this whole society. It's the future of our generation.
It's the basis
It's the future
of
of
our
economy.
existence in most communities is raising the next generation.
Yeah, and the baby boomers are aging at the moment, and we're going to need a huge workforce to look after them, to care for them. And where does that come from? It comes from the generation being raised now. It's the most productive thing. And the genuine progress indicator actually values that, where GDP does not. And that is enormous.
It factors it all in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a really good one. GPI isn't everything, of course.
Yep.
So in my work, I'm going to be looking at a lot of well-being frameworks that governments are adopting as well. So governments at the moment are tasking their statistical agencies, like the Australian Bureau of Statistics, to collect numbers on well-being in the country. And that differs from country to country. And no one's really looked at how they're defining well-being or what they're measuring. And so that's what I'm going to task myself with.
Excellent.
There are over 20 countries around the world who are doing this. Some countries are actually calling themselves a well-being economy.
Right.
And I'm going to look at all of them and see what they're thinking.
That sounds like such a worthwhile task, James.
Yeah.
Because I was looking up some of this GPI stuff, but I can't see how it's being applied. Like I'd love to see some different outcomes of a GPI measurement, from year to year to see whether that's improving or not. That sort of measurement, to me, I would have thought would be essential, and yet I can't. Maybe I'm not looking properly, but I can't find the information. It's not widely applied.
Yeah, it's in its infancy in terms of getting into governments and governance and policy. So it's going to be hard to actually see how it affects things until we can look at it for 5-10 years. How have we gone?
And surely these are crucial measurements,
Yeah.
And this is where if you're looking at a GPI. Where things like the term degrowth, and maybe degrowth should be called rebalance, something more positive.
Yeah, I like degrowth and regrowth.
Degrowth and regrowth. It's kind of like we were saying before, language is difficult. So if you use a negative term, it puts people off straight away. Because remember, people are not on this station and not in this community. People are stupid, right? You have to remember this. They do. They read stupid newspapers and they make stupid decisions. They're clever and they're lovely in some things. This is something if you ever get involved in politics and you go door knocking and you start meeting people, random people, as opposed to your little bubble, you roll up to these houses and you see all these lovely people doing amazing things who are absolutely clueless. And that's what we're dealing with. So if you're going to use a term like degrowth, these people, they'll have it framed to them by the Murdoch press or something, going that we're going to collapse society. We're going to pull apart stuff. You have to find the right words to convince these people that what you're trying to achieve is in their best interests, which is difficult.
Well, it all comes back to another economic concept as well, of loss aversion. So Daniel Kahneman and a number of other behavioural economics were looking at how people don't actually do rational things, which is the basis of neoclassical economics. So loss aversion is a cognitive bias that describes why, for individuals, the pain of losing is psychologically twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining. So loss hurts more then gaining is good.
Gaining is good. And I guess that underlines why it's so easy to pull a referendum apart, is that you can apply yourself to people's fear of loss. It's a lot more effective than applying to their sense of goodwill or progressive thoughts.
Yeah, and, you look at the No campaign, and a lot of that was based on you're going to lose if this goes on, and it's a very powerful thing.
Yeah.
It's very powerful. The fear of losing something is a lot more than the goodness of gaining something in people's eyes.
Can I just tell you something from something it's taken me quite some time to learn, is that loss can be very liberating, James. When you lose stuff, you realise, actually, I didn't need it anyway.
Yeah. Well, I'm very influenced by the voluntary simplicity movement, which is associated with degrowth, which is essentially saying, simplify your life. You don't need much to live on to live a good life. It's very Buddhist in nature.
Yeah.
And one of the professors in my master's degree, Samuel Alexander, he's a big degrowth proponent, and he's a big proponent of voluntary simplicity. And I would say learning about that stuff and actively simplifying my life, where I don't have many things, I don't have much money, I don't buy much food, very simple. I cook pasta a lot,
Yeah.
But the less things I have, the happier I am. There's a quote in Fight Club. I've got to quote that movie.
That is such a good movie, Fight Club.
The things you own end up owning you.
Correct.
And I took that to heart, and it has bettered my life.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Life is about community, not about how many things you have. Speaking of community, we're heading off to the Union Club Hotel after this show to go and catch up with other like-minded people for a drink and a feed, maybe. Feel free to come and join us, the Union Club Hotel in Collingwood. We've got to go, James. We've done another show. We've got Mafalda coming up next with Vicky. We've got to get the hell out of here. So thank you so much for filling in for Anne for the last couple of weeks. We're going to have you back on as often as we can, because I like you, and so Anne, you're a nice fella. So,
thank you.
So we'll do this all again.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Kev.
No problems. We're going to go. Bye.
You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radiommt@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime, wherever you get your podcasts, or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org, educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gun Theory? Like, they're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of, macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.